Welcome, everybody. Today on the show, we have Dr. Jon Zawislak, Master Beekeeper. Thanks so much for joining us today, John.
My pleasure to be here, Jed. Thanks for the invitation.
This is super exciting. This is going to be fun. Let's start with fun stuff. You've been in beekeeping for years. What's the most surprising thing you've learned about bees over the years?
I would say bees just keep surprising me. It's never the same game twice. No two colonies are really exactly the same. They all seem to have their own personalities. I love to just get in there and open up a hive. It seems like everything else just sort of melts away. You're in the now. That's what I enjoy about it. Just looking at a hive, trying to puzzle out what's going on, what they need, what they have, and whether that's sufficient for the part of the season you're in. So that's all great. And when everything works, and they're making honey, they're making more bees, it just brings joy to your heart. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. Do you be genuine? Not that you wouldn't be otherwise, but do you, with all of your experience, feel like you are still learning about
Oh,
bees?
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
There's always finer details we can learn. It's everything is so nuanced. And I'm by no means perfect. I fail sometimes. I'll lose a colony, I'll lose a queen, and I'll try to set it right. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But kind of use all that knowledge that we have and keep going.
Have you ever been in a beekeeping situation? I'm sure you have. Like, tell us about a beekeeping situation that went terribly wrong. What happened, and just kind of walk us through it.
Oh, I don't know if anything went terribly wrong, but I was terribly embarrassed one time, kind of early in my career as the honeybee specialist for Arkansas Extension. I was helping a fellow with his hives. He was kind of new at it, and he was having trouble finding his queen bee. So I pointed it out and I said, "Well, I've got a thing here. Let's mark your queen for you." And I had one of those little plastic tubes with the plunger, and so we caught his queen and I put it in there and we marked her and I pulled it back and she just clunk fell over sideways. I
What
had
happened?
I had pushed the little plunger, it's got a sponge on it, so so it's supposed to be soft, but apparently I had pushed just a little too hard and literally knocked the wind out of her. I thought I had killed her. And so I was thinking, okay, I've got to run home and get one of my own queens and bring it back over here for this guy and replace his. But kind of played it off like, oh yeah, that happens sometimes. We got to be careful. And then we set her aside, and a few minutes later, she kind of woke up, started wiggling around, and then she gave me a dirty look and crawled back down into the frames. But I was so embarrassed, but it worked out okay.
That's a great story. It is incredible how resilient bees are, more than you would think, and flexible.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
to that, just related to that story, one of the struggles that new beekeepers have, and frankly, I'm still having, and not I have not mastered, is picking up the queen. Tell us about the strategy for picking up a queen, different tactics that you use, what you would recommend.
Yeah, I guess the easiest way is to just do it with your fingers. I don't know if you wear gloves. I typically don't wear gloves unless I'm doing something I know that bees aren't going to like. But I will grab her by, you know, both wings, or both sets of wings, and just pluck her right off of the comb. And then you take your other hand and you grab her by both back legs and let go of her wings, and then you can just mark them with a pin. But if you're not marking them, you can just pick them up by the wings, put them into a cage or anything else that you need to do, or just physically move them down. But if I don't need to, I'll avoid handling the queen at all. I've
Yeah, totally.
I've been holding frames up and looking for the queen, and she drops off into tall grass. Because I don't have that frame over the hive. I've been down on my hands and knees looking for a queen, and that kind of thing. So again, stuff happens. You learn from your mistakes and you carry on.
Yeah, that's good advice actually. The well, first of all, great instructions on how to pick up a queen. Other good advice, if you don't know where the queen is, keep the frame over the hive to the extent that you can. I've had that same thing happen to me. Um, if you could bust one myth about bees, what would it be?
Hmm. I guess a few years ago, beekeeping became really popular with CCD, colony collapse, and everybody wanted to save the bees. And I think a lot of people jumped into it thinking beekeeping is easy. It's just a bunch of bugs. You throw them in a box. People have been doing it for thousands of years. What is there to know? And of course, the learning curve for beekeeping is pretty steep. So I would encourage anybody who thinks that they're interested in beekeeping to think about that. Read up on it and then do a little math. It's not cheap to get into beekeeping. By the time you buy the hives and the bee suit and the tools that you need and then bees, you've got a significant investment there, and you really need to be prepared for what you're doing, or you potentially are gonna burn through a lot of money on the front end.
Yeah, I always chuckle a little bit when I see the YouTube videos about all the money, the quick money that people can make beekeeping. Um, I don't know if that's a myth or a lie, but I think even the commercial beekeepers would say the margins are pretty thin.
Yeah.
Um,
Now your commercial beekeepers, though, they're producing honey in, 50-gallon drums. So they're not going down to the farmer's market making 7, 8, $9 a pound on a jar of honey. They're lucky to get $2 a pound selling it to a big packer. So it's kind of a different strategy altogether. But I think people go to the farmer's market like that and they say, honey, $10 a pound. Well, how much honey do you get out of a hive? And, on a good year, you can get quite a bit. And they think, oh, that's just money in the bank. Those flow hives came out a few years ago. And the advertisements, the videos that they had for those made it look just so easy. There was a lady with a stack of pancakes who just went out and you turn a little spigot and the honey pours out on your pancakes. So, you know, what do you possibly need to know to do that? But I think probably a lot of people invested in those and they're quite expensive. And if you drain all the honey out, depending on where you live, where I live, we get one really good honey flow. And if you drain all the honey out, then your bees are not going to have enough to get through the winter. So without any knowledge behind that, I think that was probably going to be disastrous for a lot of new beekeepers.
you have to admit it was good marketing, though. I bet
Oh,
they
great
sold a
marketing.
lot of hives.
Yeah. They sold millions of dollars worth of those before they even manufactured one. So
Yeah,
I guess more power to you if you can do that.
yeah. The other advice I would give to new beekeepers that you're implying here is if you can, go out and do it. Go with a beekeeper and see if you
Mhm.
like it. Go out with them a couple times and
Yeah.
get sweaty and see how you
Volunteer
like
to
it.
work for somebody else for a couple of days
Yeah,
and find
get
out what
stung a
it's
few
really
times. See
like.
how you like
Get
that.
stung a few times, yeah, because it will happen.
Yeah, yeah. Great advice. Thank you. All right, let's talk about your background and personal journey. How
Mhm.
did you first get interested in beekeeping and what led you to make it a career?
I kind of fell into it completely by accident, but fell in love with it. I studied botany in college, and then when I was finished with that, I didn't know what to do, and I took a summer job working in an entomology lab for a professor who needed somebody with some experience with plants to work on a project. So I spent the summer with him, and then he asked me if I wanted to stick around, for the rest of the year and keep working, and I said sure, and that turned into 8 years in his lab. And among other things, he was a beekeeper, and so we would catch swarms and things like that. And one thing led to another, and after that time, I was offered a chance to get a master's degree. They would pay my tuition, and so I said, okay, well, why not? I've been doing this a long time, so I worked on a project with bees, and right as I was finishing up, nobody was really interested in studying bees at the time, but right about the time I was finishing up is when colony collapse disorder hit the headlines, and everybody was afraid all the bees are dying. We're all going to starve to death without honeybees and all that. So they offered a position for a honeybee specialist down in Little Rock. And so um, I said, well, I could do that. And I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And, it would just, it worked out. They said, we can guarantee 2 years of salary. And so I've been there now over 16 years. So
Wow.
it worked out.
Tell us a little bit about that. You mentioned the masters. What does it take to be a master beekeeper, like beginning to end? I'm sure there's plenty of beekeepers that are out there that have been doing this for years, like myself,
Mhm.
that want to know.
So that was a master's degree. So a master's in entomology is what I got. And then I became the kind of the state beekeeping specialist for the Cooperative Extension Office here in Arkansas. And most people in a position like mine in other states have all had PhDs. So I felt like I needed some credentials. So I looked around at the different master beekeeper programs that were available, and there was a number of them. There's a lot more now than there were then. This was in 2009. And I settled on the Eastern Apicultural Society, which is a pretty big organization. They have a great meeting every year. A lot of the other programs offered by different states, you had to progress through different levels. You start as a certified beekeeper and a journeyman beekeeper and a master beekeeper. You kind of had to work your way up, and it could take anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And then I found the the EAS. You could do it in 1 week, and I thought, oh, well, that's what I'm going to do. That'll be easy. And boy, have I never been more wrong. That was one of the hardest series of tests that I've ever taken. It requires an encyclopedic level of book knowledge. So there's a written exam, and then there's a lab practical where you look under microscopes at specimens, or you have pieces of equipment and you have to explain their use and things like that. Then there's a field exam where you have to go out with another. It was one then. Now it's a panel of two master beekeepers, and you have to demonstrate that you can open up a hive, inspect it, synthesize all your observations, and kind of develop a plan for the immediate and long-term needs of that colony on the spot. You've got maybe half an hour to do that. So that's kind of intimidating. And then the last part is an oral exam. So you have to sit in front of a panel of master beekeepers that fire questions at you that you don't know in advance, and you have to give a complete, well-reasoned, and truthful answer. And the questions come at you just like you would experience, in your life as a beekeeper. You get questions all the time. Of course, the number one question is, do you ever get stung? Right? Things like that. But questions from a reporter, or the city council wants to change this law. How would you advise them? Things like that. So that was a very intimidating process, and I'm happy to say that I did pass all of the exams on the first try. I think there was about a 20% passing rate then, which is about what it is now. But I had just finished my master's in entomology, so I was well versed in, insect biology, and I had just finished reading every published paper I could find on varroa mites and bee management and bee behavior. So I was kind of in just the right place, still in test taking mode. And then my job became talking to people about bees. So I think I probably did really well on the oral exam because, that's what I do all day is just talk about bees. So that's the one that I think intimidates most people, and most people have the most trouble with. They say most people would fear death or fear public speaking more than death. So
Yes,
that
yes.
shows sometimes.
Well,
But
myself included.
yeah.
Let me ask you a question on this. An average everyday beekeeper like myself, they've been beekeeping, call it 5 to 10 years. What percent, this is an impossible question, just want your thoughts on this. What percent of knowledge do they have as compared to what's needed to be a master beekeeper?
That's really going to depend on the individual. Some people just read every book they can find, and some people just try to wing it. Kind of depends on where you come from, how you learned beekeeping, who you learned it from. And there's probably a lot of misconceptions out there, but a lot of the people who come through that program, they will take the exams and they might pass some of them, but not all of them. So they come back the next year and finish up. And they're much more prepared because you get your results back and you see exactly what areas you might be lacking knowledge, whether it's bee diseases or, whatever that topic might be, and people will spend the next year really doing a deep dive into that particular topic.
Okay, excellent. Love that answer.
So
Tell
the
us about,
EAS is in a different city every year. It's going to be just outside Philadelphia this summer. So if anybody wants to go, check it out. Eastern Apicultural Society.
okay, thank you. Maybe I'll find a link to that and put it in the description.
Okay.
Thanks, John. Tell us about just before we get off of your journey and your history, tell us about the Walnut Valley Honey Company and how your family got involved in beekeeping.
Okay. Well, my wife and I lived in a neighborhood in Little Rock, Arkansas called Walnut Valley. So, we had some backyard beehives and we started selling honey to the neighbors. It just became Walnut Valley Honey Company. Uh, I tell you, if you want to move some honey, small children with a little red wagon, literally pulling it door to door, people can't buy enough. It's adorable. So they were my sales team there for a little while. But I was at a meeting one time and I picked up a lip balm kit and brought it home to my wife just on a whim. And so, something to do with the beeswax we had sitting around. I kept telling her, "I'm going to do something with that. Don't throw that wax out. That's valuable stuff." And so she started using some of it, and then she got into candle making and other products that you can make from the hive. I was mostly into, the honey side of things, but she took everything else and ran with it, started making soap, and so it just kind of mushroomed into more and more.
How many
So,
hives do you have now?
well, we just moved recently to another part of the state. We kind of pared our operation down, so we only moved with four, got rid of some, and just haven't built back up again yet. But I like to have about eight at home, and I'm actually installing an apiary right now this spring at my new laboratory here in Fayetteville. So gonna get some other work going here. So I got a full-time job, and so you start adding too many beehives, and it becomes another full-time job.
Yeah, you got to be careful.
Mm.
Those bees, all they want to do is multiply.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's switch gears and let's talk about bee health and some of the
Mhm.
research that you've done, some of your insights and experience. Tell us
Mhm.
about your research on pesticide risks and honeybees. What have you found?
Okay, so a few years ago, there was a lot of talk about neonicotinoids, which is a fairly new class of insecticides, and they became very widely used. It's the most widely class used in the world in agriculture, especially. But they became used as seed treatments. So they would plant the seeds, and they're water soluble. So a lot of the big commodity crops, corn, soybeans, cotton, things like that, they'd wrap the seeds in a coating of different pesticides, and then the plants take it up from the roots when they start to grow, and it really protects the plants when they're very small. But a lot of people were suggesting that this was being translocated through plants and it would become present in pollen and nectar, and so it would be available to pollinators. And the rise of this kind of this technology, this use in agriculture really coincided with the onset of CCD. And so a lot of people suspected that there was connections, and there very well could have been, but we decided we were going to do some of our own investigations in Arkansas. And we're a very agricultural state, so we went to areas where it was, all agriculture, a lot of soybeans and cotton and corn and rice. We grow a lot of rice here, but we wanted to look at the some of the big commodity crops. that were all planted with seed treatments. And what we found was by the time the plants are big enough to flower, there's practically nothing left in the nectar, in the pollen that is available to the bees. That's just from the seed treatments. We did find some in corn pollen. Corn doesn't produce any nectar, but bees will visit corn when it tassels for about 2 weeks, and then it's all done. But they will collect pollen. But the soybean flowers, we actually couldn't detect it at all in the pollen or the nectar. We were using the National Science Laboratory, and they can get down to 1 part per billion. Um, so we it's kind of a broad topic to bring it down to just a few bullet points, but I would say based on what we found in our area, the neonics are not the boogeyman, the end all problem that they were made out to be. We did find a lot of herbicides. This was a separate study that I did where I trapped pollen in pollen traps from a number of beehives in these same agricultural areas and then also in an urban area. And we kind of compared them. Uh, once once any kind of chemicals make it into the hive, it's really hard to tell exactly where they came from, especially nectar, because you've got so many bees that are, combining nectar from different sources. And even pollen gets placed in different places. But if you trap the pollen coming in and you collect it every day or so, then you get a very good chronological sampling of an area, a couple of miles around the hive. So we were able to see exactly what bees are visiting, what plants they're visiting. You can trace the pollen back to the botanical source. And then we could also test those for the chemical residues. And again, we found practically no neonicotinoids, very, very small traces at different times of the year associated with the planting process. But we also found that bees really ignored all of those crops until it gets just really hot and dry here. And then bees move into these agricultural fields, um, which may be the only thing in bloom because they're irrigated. But a few weeks later, they move back out into the weeds. And so a lot of the herbicides are used by the farmers to get rid of those weeds. And those are the same plants that the bees are really looking for around the edges of the fields because these areas we were in, they might be 80% cultivated with maybe 3 or 4 crops. And so the bees are getting almost all of their protein, their pollen from wild plants on the margins. So interesting stuff to look at.
Well, tell me, two-part question. Once you've done the research, like you personally, and you make those discoveries, what role do you play? Like what is your responsibility to do with that information? And then the second part of the question is what is a beekeeper like myself? What are beekeepers' role in supporting bee health in agricultural landscapes?
Okay, so well, the first part, what's my responsibility as a researcher? Well, that's to publish and publicize what we found. Try to make sense of it, first of all. What conclusions can we draw from the data? And then the peer review process puts that same data in front of other scientists to look at, and they might say, that's a valid conclusion, or they might say, you're completely off base. So there's a whole process that goes through before that actually becomes published in a journal. And then once it's out there, I mean, if we don't publish it, then it was really a big waste of money just for my own curiosity is not a good reason to do a big study. But once we have that, then we have the responsibility of sharing that. And so we did a lot of that at grower meetings, at beekeeper meetings. So we kind of try to share what we know. And any study that I do is just a tiny little piece of the overall puzzle. There's so many other scientists doing research on honeybees. And I'm not trying to minimize the effects that neonics can have on bees. They're definitely not doing bees any favors, but on the flip side, if we were to get rid of that class of chemicals and go back to the stuff that people were using before, that maybe were a lot more potent and broad spectrum and applied as what we call a foliar application, so applied over the top of the plant instead of taken up from the roots, then there's actually a lot of overspray and drift and a lot of potential for those chemicals to maybe get into the bees' food supply that way. So it's a
Pick your
little from
poison.
column A, a little from column B. Yeah, pick your poison literally.
Mhm.
But getting back to the herbicides that we talked about, herbicide use has really skyrocketed in recent years. And a lot of that goes back to Roundup ready crops, the herbicide tolerant crops. It's not just Roundup, there's other ones. But when they engineer crops to be resistant to a herbicide, then growers can use it to get rid of all the weeds. Then that really reduces the nutrition that a landscape can provide to not just honeybees, but the thousands of other native bees that are around and other pollinators, butterflies and other things. So you name it.
Thanks for sharing. It's fascinating. And on the second part of the question, like normal everyday beekeepers, what role should we play in bee health?
I think that we're called to be good stewards of the land, and we want a healthy landscape for our bees. So making others aware of that, without being too dogmatic and demanding, but plant more flowers. That's what we need. A lot of the science that has looked at the decline of bees and pollinators and other insects, the number one driver is habitat loss, habitat destruction, which impacts nutrition for the honeybees. And when they have poor nutrition, it cascades into every other aspect of bee health. And then that also it affects honey production, it affects brood production, and how well bees survive the winter. So, we have all these factors working together that really put a lot of different stresses on the bees.
Tell me if you feel this is just a personal change that I've seen in me since I've done beekeeping. I used to always walk by or drive by the yards that were well groomed, well mowed, and admire those and want to have those, which is still true to some degree. But I have a lot more respect for the yards that are not well kept and that have weeds and different flowers in them because I think it's better for the bees. Do you have any perspective on that?
I kind of feel the same way. I kind of grew up living in the country, and if it was green, it was a lawn. I don't like to see everybody having a golf course fairway, block after block after block, with one Bradford pear tree in the corner of each lot. It's like we cut all the trees down now, and then we name the streets after them and call it a subdivision, but it's very unnatural. So yeah, I like the clover, the dandelions, all that kind of stuff. I
Interesting.
think we need wild areas for the bees, but I think our own mental health, we just need wildness.
Yeah, it's interesting how the perspective changes as you get more information. I appreciate that. All right, let's talk a little bit about best practices and methods. Okay, always a hot topic is
Mhm.
how do you manage your hive? What strategy do you employ to prevent swarming or minimize swarming and maximize honey production?
Well, there's no one silver bullet answer for that, obviously, or we'd all be doing it. But you've got to ensure sufficient space for your bees in the springtime, and that so that they don't run out of room and want to swarm too quickly. Some of that depends on, the genetics of the bees. Some just sit there, and then boom, they just, they explode in population. Others will just kind of grow from the get-go. Uh, what you need to keep an eye on them. And my personal strategy is to make splits when I see that they're getting ready to swarm. I will take the Usually, I'll take the old queen out, put her in a nuke box with some resources and bees. She's an experienced queen, she's already laying eggs, and so she's going to rebuild a population fairly quickly. And if you think about it, that's what the bees really want to do. When they swarm, the old queen goes and starts a new home. The new queen inherits a turnkey operation, right? She's got brood, she's got food, she's already got drawn combs. So allowing that new queen to stay there. The old queen, she's moved into another box. It's got more room, smaller population. So that kind of short circuits or shortcuts that swarming instinct, kind of cuts it off, and that new queen is not likely to swarm this year. So that's my preferred strategy.
You run out of space really quickly if you do that. Like you mentioned your eight hives, your eight or your four hives go to
Mhm.
eight, go to 12, go to 20 pretty
Yeah,
fast.
but there's also a ready market for more bees. I've sold nukes off when that happens. One year, oh my gosh, it seemed like they wanted to all swarm 3 times. So I got some cheap cardboard boxes and I sold off a bunch of nukes. And nukes are worth a lot of money these days. They're going for 180 to $240. Different places that I've been, I always kind of ask around, what's your going rate? So a couple $100 for a nuke, you sell off 4 nukes. That's not bad. That'll
So
pay
there
for
you go. All
that'll pay for your jars to put your honey in later, and you can put all that back into your beekeeping operation.
yeah, I like that. I haven't thought of the strategy that way. Um, okay, let's get your thoughts on the different hive designs. You mentioned flow hives. We could talk more about that if you want, but Langstroth, top bar, please share your thoughts.
I think that they're all valid. It just kind of depends on what people want, how many resources they've got to get started. The top bar hives are very simple. They might require a little bit more in terms of regular inspection, just to make sure that they stay on track. Um, they were designed by I think Peace Corps volunteers for use in the developing world for people who don't have access to dimensional lumber and power tools to make these perfect square boxes. And so you can pull apart packing crates and put them together. So the only real critical dimension is the kind of the width of the top bar needs to match how big bees naturally make the comb. And so they're very economical to get started. You don't produce as much honey in one of those compared to a Langstroth in the same conditions, but you harvest the comb, so you get a lot more wax.
Hmm.
So, you just need to have a reason to incorporate that into your beekeeping, make candles or something like that. Flow hives, those are, like I said, those are kind of pricey. We mentioned those before, but it's basically a Langstroth hive. But if you only wanted one beehive ever, then it might be a good investment. But if you wanted more than one, I don't think that it makes economic sense because the cost of one flow hive, you could get a really nice extractor that you could use with a dozen hives or 100 hives. So investing that much over and over and over again is probably not cost effective. So kind of depends on the scale. But if you only wanted one beehive and never wanted another one, just enough honey for personal use, then not having to buy an extractor and then store that extractor again, and all that, maybe it would be worth it.
Okay,
Some
great.
people like, those, what do you call them? The Layens hives or the horizontal hives. Those are popular with some people, so there's no heavy lifting. Again, perfectly valid. You just have to remember that the bees will live in anything. Bees live in a hollow tree. You could leave any old container out in your yard and a bee swarm might build in it. So if they're happy, I'm happy. But I have so much equipment, that I already own. I'm kind of married to Langstroth hives. I've got different size boxes, but I've got an extractor which is designed for Langstroth boxes. So I'm going to stick with that until, my poor bad back gives out and I can't do anything ever again.
I can appreciate that. Um, Also, always a hot topic is the treatment for bees. So tell us, share with us your thoughts on treatment-free beekeeping,
Mhm.
and combine with that or separate from that, we know that almost all beekeepers struggle with varroa mites. What do
Mhm.
you consider to be the most effective strategy?
You could probably not find a single topic that will divide beekeepers into two camps faster and really start a fight between beekeepers faster than the idea of treatment versus treatment free or natural beekeeping, whatever you want to call it. I think it's important to remember that beekeeping is not natural. There's nothing natural about keeping bees down close to the ground in a nicely painted box. They want to be 15, 20 feet up in the air away from bears and skunks and people for that matter. So a lot of the things that we do are very unnatural. But all of the problems that our honeybees have right now are also imported by people. We brought bees over here,
Mhm.
and we also brought all the other bugs and diseases and things. Some of them came from Europe, where our honeybees came from, but others came from Asia, from a completely different species of bee. And that's a result of humans moving all those problems around the world. So we've only got ourselves to blame for that. As far as what should you do, that's a really a personal call. I'm not gonna get into the moral aspect of that. I think you can keep bees any way that you want, as long as you try to be the best you can for the bees. There's a group called Certified Naturally Grown. Are you familiar with them?
I'm not.
It's kind of a grassroots alternative to organic certification for produce and also for bees, because it's really impossible to produce organic honey here in the US. All the organic honey comes from New Zealand or South America or Africa, places that don't have a lot of row crops. But where can you go in the US that, is 3 miles away from anywhere that's ever had a fertilizer or a fungicide or herbicide or insecticide sprayed on it? So the C&G, the Certified Naturally Grown, it's an organization that's run by a lot of volunteers, but they kind of oversee each other, and they certify that maybe you are as organic as possible on your own property, but you acknowledge that bees will leave the reservation, and we can't control where they go. So we control as much as we can. So there's actually a handbook of natural beekeeping that they have. I'm on their apiary advisory board, so I help to develop that. But it really lists a lot of the prohibited substances and acceptable substances that you can put in beehives for Varroa control. So that's a great resource. Maybe you can even put a link to it down below the video down there. But that's a great resource, and that's a great organization. So anybody who's interested in that, you can put their logo on your jars of honey that says, you're as natural as possible. I think that we have a whole range of treatments for Varroa. Some work better than others. I've got my favorites, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best. I think formic acid is a fantastic product. It penetrates the cappings and kills the mites under the cappings. So it really knocks them down, and it will keep their levels low for a long time. They are always going to rebuild, but it's dangerous if you don't handle it right, and it's very temperature sensitive, so it's not always a good choice, especially here in the South where I live, and it gets really hot in the summer, and you can't use it in your hives without probably causing some damage to the bees. So that one's not always a possibility. Oxalic acid can work. It can keep mite levels low, but it's not really a good product for knocking down high levels. Thymol can work. It can knock down a lot of mites. There's a number of thymol products, but again, it's temperature sensitive, so you have to kind of be careful with it, and you really don't want to use it while the honey supers are on, because it will make all of your honey taste like Vicks Vapor Rub, which probably you don't want. Then there's Apivar, the Amatraz, which is kind of the standard now that Fumafos and Fluvalinate have kind of gone away. And we had good luck with it for a long time as an industry, but there's more and more resistance that's showing up in the Varroa populations. It's a product, it's a chemical that breaks down very rapidly, and so that's why probably we have seen it around for a long time, but you know, it's so, I guess you could say, used and overused by some beekeepers that its usefulness is going to go away. So the best thing that we can do as beekeepers, and really any farmer, any grower using any type of pesticide, organic or otherwise, is to rotate different treatment products. So you want to alternate different modes of action. So it attacks a different aspect of pest biology. So if you use the same product again and again, nature finds a way around it, kind of the Jurassic Park idea. They're going to figure it out. But if you hit them with product A this year, hit them with product B next year, so the same population can't get used to the same thing over and over, then you can go back to A. Maybe throw in product C once in a while, or spring versus fall, or however you want to do it. There are organic methods to getting rid of mites, but a lot of them tend to be more labor intensive, or at least perceived to be more labor intensive, and some of them work better than others. But the guys that are running 20, 30, 40, 80,000 colonies, they're not going to be able to employ some of those same methods. They've got to make decisions, and they've got to do it fast, and they've got to do it economically. So there's a lot of different strategies for that.
Do you see a world in the near or even medium future where Varroa is not a problem?
I don't see. I don't think I see a near future where Varroa is not a problem. I think that breeding bees to be tolerant or resistant to Varroa, is ultimately the direction our industry is going to have to go to be sustainable. But it's very difficult just based on the nature of the bee. They mate far away from the hive, up in the air, and I could breed a perfect bee for
Mhm.
my area, but I've got neighbors on both sides of me that keep bees, within, you could say, flight distance of where my queens could go. So if they're buying queens from California and Florida and Georgia and, no telling where, then we're all part of this, nationwide gene pool, and it's constantly being mixed and measured. And so if other people are using a lot of different chemical products, their bees are not developing any kind of resistance. And then I have a perfect queen that's resistant to everything. She goes off and mates with any old drone and comes back, and the offspring may not carry those same genes. And then the next generation, it can be less. So it's it's complicated.
It's going to take some time.
Mhm.
Uh, let's talk about the beekeeping community a little bit. How have you seen the beekeeping community evolve over the years? You are closer to the whole community than anybody traveling, speaking, etc. What has
Mhm.
been the evolution?
20 years ago, before colony collapse kind of brought beekeeping to everybody's attention, it was a hobby for bearded old men. You'd go to a beekeeping club, and it was a bunch of old timers sitting around complaining that queens weren't as good as they used to be. But if you look at the American Bee Journal from 100 years ago, guess what they were writing about? It's a bunch of old men complaining that queens weren't as good as they used to be. So that never changed. And then we had such an influx of new people into beekeeping. I think it really changed the face of it. We have a lot more women in beekeeping now, and we have a lot more younger people getting into beekeeping than we ever have before. But it's also kind of changed the nature of some of these bee clubs. You know, we had a generation of people that used to go and meet in person, and I don't see younger people, 20 somethings, that like to go once a month, drive half an hour to the library or a church basement and spend an hour listening to some guy ramble on about it. People now they want a 3-minute YouTube video that explains everything and tells them exactly what to do this week. So I think we need a community. You need to interact with a community, with other people on a face-to-face basis and kind of absorb that knowledge, even if it's not necessarily what you need to hear this week or this month. You might think back on what you learned next year when you're encountering a problem. So just, you know, taking on the knowledge of the village elders, so to speak. Um, I think that's an important part of an education that maybe some new beekeepers are not going to get just because of the way that they approach it. They think, oh, all this information is available. I can get it from books. I can find it on websites. So I don't need to go in person. And, we went through the whole COVID pandemic and a lot of the bee clubs closed down. And it seems that a lot of them have had a lot of trouble opening back up and getting people to come back and do those things in person. So we'll see.
Okay, final question, then we'll get to some rapid fire questions. You were honored with the Roger A. Morse Award. Will you tell us a little bit about what that is and what that recognition meant to you?
Okay, well, that is an award from the EAS, the Eastern Apicultural Society. Roger Morse was a professor at Cornell University, and he was professor of beekeeping and apiculture. And he really, I guess you could say, he trained an entire generation of bee scientists that are actually now all, retiring. And so they have trained another generation of bee scientists, but he was just very instrumental in kind of creating a scientific attitude about honeybees. It went from being this odd little hobby for eccentric old men into a real science, a branch of entomology. And actually, the professor that I mentioned earlier that I worked for, who taught me beekeeping, he went to Cornell and he actually learned from Roger Morse. So I'm kind of a direct descendant of that. And so the award it's given out to extension and teaching professionals, and so to be honored for that, it was it felt good to be acknowledged for the contributions that I'm trying to make.
Thanks for that. I think after spending about an hour with you, I can see that it's well deserved. Okay, we're going to let you off the hook here in a minute. These are rapid fire questions. Some of them be related, some of them not be related.
Mhm.
Uh, Everybody knows the rules, like one word answers, maybe quick phrase, whatever, and we'll take it easy on you. One
Okay,
word to describe honeybees.
amazing.
If you weren't a beekeeper, what would you be doing?
That's tough because I've got plenty of hobbies, so I do a little bit of everything. That's not one word, but
Well, maybe that'll lead to the next one. What's your favorite outdoor activity besides beekeeping?
um, I love just hiking, camping, canoeing, fishing, all that kind of stuff. I also enjoy woodworking, but I have a tiny shop, so I have to wheel all my big tools outside. Does that count?
Yeah, that counts.
Mhm.
All good.
I love cooking. I used to be a pastry chef, so I like to grill outside. I can make a huge mess and it doesn't get grease all over the kitchen, so I like to do that outside too.
You do have a lot of hobbies. I love it.
Yeah. I also, I'm also an artist. I illustrate a number of books on beekeeping.
Send those over, and I'll put links in the descriptions. I'm sure people would love to see that.
Okay.
Uh, okay, favorite book or movie?
Uh, hmm, that would be a tough one. I read a book recently that came to mind a minute ago when we were talking. It's called Shop Class for Soulcraft, and it really talks about doing things with your own hands and creating something physical in the world is much more mentally rewarding than sitting at a computer all day generating spreadsheets and PowerPoints. And it kind of talks about that community of knowledge and how important it is to network with other people. And you cannot learn everything on your own, but by having other people in your community to call upon and ask questions on really helps you to grow in any kind of craft. So that'll be a that'll be a book that I really enjoyed recently that I'll find a link to it for you.
Yeah, shoot it over. We'll add it. Thank you.
Good.
What's a food you can't live without?
A food I can't live without. I'm a big sushi fan. I know people
Okay.
love it, hate it, but just so many flavors you can pack into one mouthful there. And I live far from the coast, but when I travel to either ocean, I love fresh seafood.
I can relate. I feel the same way about the taco. What's your what's a dream travel destination for you?
I've always been intrigued with Easter Island.
Oh,
Just, it's so remote from anywhere else, and it had its own culture, produced those giant heads out in the middle of the Pacific. I think that would be a neat place to go. I've also always wanted to visit Machu Picchu. So
ooh, me
those are
too.
both of those are on my bucket list.
Probably some pretty cool bees up there in Machu Picchu.
Maybe so.
Funniest thing, or maybe most shocking thing you've ever seen bees do.
All right, so I was called up one day by a principal at a little school that wasn't too far from my office, and she said they had a bee swarm. And so I said, all right, I'll come down and take a look at it. It's only about a mile from my office. So you know, I was going to go and advise them, but also I'm thinking, ooh, a bee swarm, that's free bees. So I'm, packed up an empty box and bee suit and stuff and see what I can find. I get there and they've got all the children at the school. It was supposed to be lunchtime or recess, I forget, but they were all sequestered inside the gymnasium because of these dangerous animals on the playground. And I get there and there's a pine tree with the trunk is probably 4 feet thick and it's 60 feet up and about 30 feet out on a limb. There's the most beautiful swarm you could imagine. I mean, it was the size of a beach ball. It's the kind of swarm that everybody wants to catch, but down at ground level. So, without a bucket truck or something, or, help from the fire department, there's no way I was going to get that. So I just started explaining to the school principal and a couple of teachers, what was really going on, kind of that whole process of decision making. And there was, we were at the playground and there was a soccer field behind that. And then there was a neighborhood beyond that. And so I said, these guys have been here a little while. Pretty soon they're just going to kind of dissolve into a big cloud. They'll swirl around a couple times and they'll just fly off over that field and you'll never see them again. So not going to be a dangerous situation for the kids. And so then I turn and I look and all the kids are coming out of the gymnasium. And so the teachers are all, keeping them up against the wall. Don't get by these dangerous bees. And I turn around and look and the principal's standing there and her jaw is on the ground because that entire giant swarm of bees just dissolved into a cloud right at that moment, swirled around 3 times right over the soccer field, and disappeared right over the house that I pointed to. She looked at me and she said, "How did you make them do that?" And I said, "That's your tax dollars at work, ma'am." And she thought that I had somehow commanded the bees to leave, and she was so impressed. And so I kind of played it off like, yeah, I knew that was going to happen, but I obviously I had no idea, but just one of those things that worked out really well. So I've always enjoyed telling that story.
Sir, you only knew that because you were a master beekeeper.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. John. Thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a pleasure. I've learned so much and it's been very entertaining.
My pleasure, Jed. Maybe I'll see you around the circuit sometime.
Let's do it.